My next guest is Mrs. Jessica Moore. Jessica and I have been friends for a long time. She started here teaching in the year 2003 and taught until 2008. So that's 5 years as a full-time teacher. Then, when she and her husband started to have children, she moved away from teaching and away from the school entirely for 5 years. Then, as your kids got a little bit older, you came back to teach part-time. No, you came back as a parent.
Yes.
For 5 years.
Yes.
And then 5 years after that, you started back teaching part-time. And now you are the assistant principal for the upper school. Congratulations on your new job.
Thank you.
After all this time, now you're back full circle again. And I'd love to get your thoughts on being a principal here. But you have an interesting background growing up that differs from probably most people in our audience. Your formative years were spent overseas, mostly in Israel. Can you talk about that and how that shaped you growing up?
Sure. So yes, I grew up, my father is American and my mother is an Arab Israeli. And so we grew up moving back and forth between the United States, but spent most of my formative years in Jerusalem and also in Cairo. So, and I think also within that, most of the schools that I attended were international schools.
Right.
So it wasn't as if I was integrated wholly into the local population, but I was sort of traveling in academic circles and these international circles, but then going home to my home, which was primarily Palestinian Arab culture.
Right,
So it was very mixed.
Very eclectic.
Very mixed.
Right,
yes.
right. What impact did that have on you growing up? I mean, looking back, maybe at the time you're not very conscious of it.
Yes.
Looking back, how did that shape you?
Well, I mean, I think it informed every part of me. It became sort of the water that I swam in, and the way that it shaped the way I think about people. It shaped the way that I think about ideas. It shaped the way that I think about the world. And I think most of the time when you live in a monoculture and your parents are in the same culture and that culture in some ways, you're so familiar with it that it becomes invisible to you. And I think because I grew up in in the intersection of so many cultures, that cultural context became very visible to me. And so I learned at a young age, this is how this culture operates. This is how this culture operates. And so issues of universality, I started to recognize at a young age that many things are not universal. They're cultural.
Yes.
And so that shaped my worldview.
When you came to America, and you came to America to attend college,
Yes.
right? You went to Wheaton College.
Yeah, that was when I moved.
That you moved back to America permanently. You mentioned some of these differences. What were some differences you noticed immediately between American culture and what you'd experienced growing up?
I mean, there was a lot of culture shock. There was a lot of culture shock coming back to the U.S. at that point. Maybe broadly in my classrooms, because I was, in a college, and we were always discussing sociological questions or questions about literature. And I think you become the person who always raises your hand in the classroom and says, well, actually, that's an American perspective.
Can you give me one example of something you might recall?
I'm not sure if I can think of a specific immediately, but I think, issues of modesty, how you would define modesty would be something that certainly on a Christian campus in your freshman year, that certainly I remember as people saying, oh, that's not modest. And I said, well, actually, in my culture, that would be considered very immodest.
Right, you grew up in Arab culture.
Right, in an Arab culture. So there were other things that they would say are very immodest and I didn't have a problem with. So that would be one small area, but that, I think there were many areas where I found that to be the case.
So you learned, growing up, kind of to navigate these different worlds. And no doubt that gave you, ability to kind of tackle different kinds. I'm sure you have all these different kinds of challenges. Coming to America, being with all these different kinds of cultures. How did that... So what drew you to teaching eventually? And how did your background impact how you taught your classes?
Okay. So probably in a number of ways. I think the first thing that immediately comes to mind is that having been constantly a new student in my classroom because I moved so much, I am probably more aware of the outsider, the new, the person who's entering in the other. So I think that probably shaped my sensitivities as a teacher and as an educator to think about how can we create a whole out of the many. So that certainly is part of it. But I think it also allows me to, when we're studying literature, when we're studying rhetoric, I think I have a slightly different perspective than my students who are primarily American, and that I can kind of bring to the table and help push them a little bit to see perhaps what of their worldview is primarily from their own culture and what might be a universal, particularly Christian truth that might stand outside of their culture a little bit.
Now, you use the word rhetoric there, a big word in classical educational circles. As you came back part-time, you were exclusively a rhetoric teacher.
Yes.
Talk about rhetoric. It's a weird word many people may not know about. Why should it be taught? What does it do for those who learn it?
Okay. So yes, rhetoric is a weird word. It's one of those scary classical words that makes everyone feel uncomfortable. It's got a pejorative connotation. We don't tend to think of as rhetoric as something that we would necessarily want to learn.
Right.
But I think it's maybe the more accurate modern usage of the word would be communication. So I think if we use the word communication, I think we can all recognize that communication is something that we do that's a basic human function. And so we need to study that. We need to understand why we communicate, how we can communicate more effectively, what are the implications of the way that we communicate. And so I think also, going back to your earlier question, my background helped me become more interested in rhetoric because I recognized early on that our cultural context informs the way that we see the world and the way that we communicate with other people.
Right.
And that if we really want to be good stewards of this gift that we have to learn how to communicate in a way that our audience can really understand.
Yeah, that makes sense. In modern educational circles today, there's high emphasis on STEM fields and we might say practical practical skills, and certainly that has its place. But I look at our culture today, and of course, politically, wherever you fall on the divide, it seems like we have a crisis. Could we describe our modern political angst in some ways as a crisis of rhetoric?
Okay, so this is a question that we actually talk a lot about in our Rhetoric 1 class. And I find, especially since I've returned to teaching this in the last 2 years, that my students are coming to my class asking me that question in a way they weren't 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So we spend a lot of time in Rhetoric 1 talking about the structure of an argument. And we talk about how an argument isn't an argument unless it has a claim and a reason. But that underneath the reason and the claim, the way that we formulate that argument is by an unarticulated shared assumption that we have with our audience. And if we share that value, that unstated assumption, then our arguments land. If we don't share that, then our arguments don't land. And I think we spend a lot of time sort of evaluating those arguments and identifying those unstated underlying values and assumptions. And I think the problem that we have in our modern discourse is that we have a claim, we have our evidence, but we are not interested in creating arguments that would actually persuade a person who does not share our unstated assumption.
Right.
So what that becomes is instead of, it's not really actual persuasion. It's not really rhetoric in the sense that we're not persuading someone who already disagrees with us, but rather we are persuading those who already share those same assumptions.
Right. We're not doing the kind of deep level, we might say, sort of. We're not taking the effort. We're not doing the hard thing. We're doing the easy thing.
We're doing the easy thing.
We know what will get a reaction.
Yes. It builds consensus. It builds excitement with people who already agree with us. It consolidates our tribe, right?
Sure.
But it doesn't actually persuade someone.
It doesn't actually persuade. It doesn't actually move us forward as a culture. Right. In your first stint here as a teacher, you also taught literature. And I'd be curious for your thoughts. I know you're a big fan of a lot of modern fiction.
Yes, I am.
And we might think, a classical teacher will only read the classics and so on. What are the virtues of modern fiction?
Oh, that's funny because I didn't realize that was the perception, that if you're a classical teacher, you don't read modern fiction. So I think that's funny. But, I think the question would be, why do we read? Mm-hmm. And I think we read to understand others. I think we read to find ourselves, to understand ourselves. I think we read in order to find descriptions and stories that describe the human condition in a way that our daily lives do not automatically reflect. And so I think the classics are the time-tested works that have done that.
Right.
And we go back to because they've already done that. But I don't think that great writing stopped 200 years ago. I think we have inspiration. We have great writers today. I think that continues to today. So I love reading modern fiction because I would say that I like the genre I enjoy is literary fiction. So maybe that's a little bit more highbrow, but I love reading modern writers who can still do that, who are still pursuing those questions, answering those deeper questions of what does it mean to be human. And I find that, and also I think a lot of modern writers are perfecting forms, new forms, exciting forms, pushing boundaries that you can appreciate because you've read the classics.
So the classics, in your opinion, form the foundation.
Right.
For your appreciation of modern authors.
Right. So I think that having read the classics, I can understand, enjoy, appreciate, and also have a thought about the modern writers that I'm reading.
Which author or which book has shaped you the most?
One book?
One book or one author?
Modern or?
Okay. Just whatever.
Okay, so I would say, I think probably in my 20s, C.S. Lewis, I would say Till We Have Faces was an excellent book that helped me to understand definitions of love, healthy, unhealthy forms of love. But then I think I have to give you a couple more because I think other books that have shaped me would be Jhumpa Lahiri's Interpreter of Melodies, which is a collection of short stories that describe identity, that talk about identity and how that's formed in various contexts and cultures.
Right. Is she from India?
Yeah, she's yes, she is native Indian Indian, and then I think she writes in English and actually recently also in Italian.
So that's an interesting, so your culture and identity and navigating those different places, that certainly would connect with you.
Yes, that definitely connects with me. So I think those would be two books that I think that I would say have really impacted the way that I see the world.
By the end of this year,
yes.
Now you step into a new role here at Advantis. How do you think, what led you to take this job? And how do you think this job will change you as assistant principal?
That is a good question. The reason I took this job, I think, the first time I stepped into a classroom at Advantis many, many years ago, I come from a very mixed background, and so the term home is an important one to me. And I think the first time I stepped into an Advantis classroom, I felt like I was home. And that I have never been able to shake that feeling, even after I left and I came back. So that is certainly a big part of the reason. And last spring, when I watched the seniors do their senior thesis, and that's always an important moment for me to get to see the full expression of who they are and what they've learned. I spent some time then thinking about what makes Adfantes home, what makes Adfantes such a beautiful community of learning, that brings out their best selves, who God has made them to be. And I knew at that point, I started praying at that point that maybe God would open up a new avenue for me to be able to participate in Adfantes in another way, some small way that was not. And when I asked myself if that could be more teaching, I thought, well, maybe something else. Maybe there could be some other way for me to participate and form and be a part of this community that wasn't just teaching. So that was because I had that thought and that prayer, when Mr. Luckenbaugh and others started to approach me about this job, I think I was prepared to start to think about saying yes at that point.
Yes. So what makes Adfantes home for you? Or home-like for you?
Yes. I think what makes it home is, it may sound cheesy, but I think it's the love that is here. I think what makes it feel like home is the sense that I am in a community of like-minded people who love God, who love their subjects, who love each other, and who truly want our community, every member of our community, to grow and be whatever it is that God has for them. And so it's not forcing us all into the same mode. There is an allowance for differences and ideas and differences in strengths and weaknesses. But within all of that, there is a fundamental community of respect and love that allows us to be a place where we can be safe and flourish as individuals.
How do you think, you didn't get to my second part of second part of my question, how will it change you?
Well, I think I don't know the answer to that yet.
Right, of course.
Because I haven't done it yet. But I think it's going to give me a lot of more respect for the amount of work that goes into creating a functional institution. So certainly,
right.
That I think that it's a lot easier to stand on the outside and see a problem here or a problem there and say, we could make that better.
Right.
It's a lot harder to make it better.
To make it better, absolutely.
It's a lot harder to make it better. It's a lot harder to find a way to solve those issues.
I think
I'm sure, yes.
Yeah, no, I think it's funny you say, I thought about getting involved some little way, like maybe being assistant principal.
No, I was not. That was not my plan. It's funny because 3 things I've said in life: I will never teach. I will never homeschool.
Right.
I will never be a principal of any kind.
Well, there you go.
And so God has a bigger imagination than I do.
I know. So you doomed yourself.
I know.
Yeah,
my
never
friends
say
like
never.
to remind me of that.
Well, that's fantastic. Jessica, it's been wonderful to have you.
Thank you.
I really appreciate all that you shared with us. As you leave, before you leave, I should say, I always like to ask our guests these 2 questions.
Okay.
And I'd like you to speak as a parent.
Okay.
We've had people, speak as students. I'd like you to speak as a parent on this. What is the most challenging thing about being a parent of an Adventist student? And what is the most rewarding thing about being the parent of an Adventist student?
Okay. The most challenging thing about being a parent of an Adventist student is to know when to step back, because they are doing hard things, and you can't do that for them. You have to let them do it on their own. So whether that's the catapult project in fifth grade,
Right.
or their book in the bag project in second grade. I think the most challenging thing in some ways as a parent, because most of us who are parents are so invested in our
If you're
child's
here,
education.
you're invested.
We are invested. We want
care.
this for them. We are excited that they're doing it. So to let them be in charge of their own education, try, fail, figure it out, you got to let them do that.
Right. We say the same thing to upper school parents.
Right.
And that's an interesting point. But yeah, and that gets in some ways harder and harder to do as their choices get more and more, have more and more of an impact on things. But that's kind of when you have to back away further and further. And yes, emotionally as a parent, I get that totally. It can be difficult to do. Wait till your kids start to drive.
I can't wait.
Oh my goodness.
I can wait. Yes.
What's the most rewarding thing about being a parent?
The most rewarding thing is when you see your child shining with that joy of learning. When they get up and they've done the hard thing and they're not just fulfilling the project, but they are excited and they're doing it with joy.
Not just checking a box.
Not just checking a box. They're getting up, they're doing their presentation, they're showing you the report, and they are delighted to have done it, delighted to have been able to do the thing, even if it was hard. I think that is the most rewarding. And I mean, my daughter is still young; she'll be in sixth grade this year. But to start to see them enjoy learning, to have conversations with them at home. Right before I came here, where they were listening to a debate podcast, Loki versus Athena. And so we paused it. I said, can you tell me who these characters were? And she already had a very substantial argument about who was the better
Who
god.
did she pick?
Loki.
Loki. Oh, interesting.
She has some hard feelings towards Athena.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Loki
that
is
I learned
pretty
about
fun.
today.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. There you go.
So to see her already have an opinion, already have an idea, be excited about it, engaged, interested. I mean, there's nothing better.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to close. Jessica, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you.
And thank you for taking on this role. We look forward to all the ways in which you will bless our community this year.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you again.